The dust kicked up around Grace Carmichael's worn boots as she stood in the middle of Cimarron's Main Street in New Mexico territory, clutching a letter that had just arrived from her sister back east. The words blurring through tears she refused to let fall in public on this scorching afternoon in July of 1882. Grace had made the mistake of sharing her deepest hope with her family during her last visit to Boston, 6 months prior. She had told them that despite being 23 years old and unmarried, despite the hardships of running a small boarding house in a dusty frontier town, she still believed in finding true love. The kind of love where a man would see past her plain appearance and modest circumstances, where he would cherish her mind and spirit, where they would build something beautiful together against all odds. Her mother had laughed first, a brittle sound that cut through the parlor like breaking glass. Her sisters had joined in, their faces twisted with mockery and pity. Even her father had shaken his head sadly, as though she had confessed to believing in fairy tales at an age when she should know better. The letter in her hand contained more of the same ridicule. Her youngest sister had written to inform her that she was now engaged to a wealthy banker, adding with barely concealed glee that Grace should give up her foolish romantic notions and accept that some women were simply meant to live practical, loveless lives. Perhaps she could return to Boston and become a governess or a paid companion to some elderly widow. At least that would be respectable. Grace crumpled the letter in her fist and looked around the dusty street of Cimarron. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden storefronts and hitching posts. A few townspeople moved about their business, paying her no mind. She had lived here for 3 years now, ever since her aunt had passed away and left her the small boarding house on the edge of town. It was not much, just 6 rooms that she rented to travelers and the occasional cowhand looking for a place to stay between jobs. But it was hers, and she had made it a warm, welcoming place even if her bank account rarely held more than a few dollars at a time. She turned to head back toward her boarding house, her shoulders squared with determination despite the ache in her chest. Let them laugh. She would rather die an old maid out here in the territory than settle for a loveless marriage back east just to satisfy her family's expectations. As she walked past the general store, she nearly collided with a man emerging from the doorway carrying a large sack of grain over one shoulder. He caught her arm to steady her, and she looked up into a pair of startling blue eyes set in a sun-weathered face. "Pardon me, miss," he said, his voice a low drawl that carried the cadence of Texas. "I was not watching where I was going." Grace found herself momentarily speechless. The man stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and dark hair that brushed his collar beneath his worn Stetson. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, faded denim and dusty leather, but there was something in his bearing that suggested both strength and gentleness. "No harm done," she managed to say, stepping back to put proper distance between them. "I was not paying attention either." He tipped his hat to her, a gesture that seemed oddly courtly for a rough cowboy. As he moved past her to load the grain onto a waiting horse, Grace noticed the way he handled the heavy sack with ease, the way his movements were efficient and careful. She shook her head at her own foolishness. Here she was, just minutes after reading her sister's mocking letter, already moon-eyed over a stranger who had done nothing more than keep her from falling on her face in the street. She hurried back to her boarding house, letting herself in through the front door and pausing in the small entryway to compose herself. The house smelled of the bread she had baked that morning and the lemon oil she used to polish the furniture. It was clean and orderly, a reflection of the care she poured into every corner of her life here. Her current boarders were few. Old Mr. Patterson occupied the room at the end of the hall, a retired prospector who paid his rent on time and kept mostly to himself. The Sanders brothers, two young ranch hands, shared a room on the second floor and came and went with their work. That left 3 empty rooms, which meant 3 sources of income she desperately needed. Grace moved through to the kitchen and began preparing supper, letting the familiar motions calm her troubled thoughts. She chopped vegetables for stew and set a pot of coffee on the stove. Through the window, she could see the mountains in the distance, purple and imposing against the endless blue sky. This was her home now, for better or worse. She had chosen this life, chosen independence and possibility over the suffocating certainty of Boston society. A knock at the front door interrupted her reverie. Wiping her hands on her apron, Grace went to answer it, expecting perhaps one of the townspeople or a traveler looking for a room. Instead, she found the tall cowboy from earlier standing on her porch, his hat in his hands. "Forgive the intrusion, miss," he said. "I am looking for lodging, and the clerk at the general store said you might have a room available. My name is Xavier Eastwick. I will be working at the Double R Ranch for the season, and I need a place in town for my days off." Grace's heart did an unexpected flutter which she firmly ignored. This was business, nothing more. "I do have rooms available, Mr. Eastwick. The rate is $3 a week, which includes breakfast and supper. I keep a respectable house, no drinking or gambling on the premises, and I expect my boarders to conduct themselves like gentlemen." "That suits me fine, miss." He trailed off, waiting for her to supply her name. "Mrs. Carmichael," she said, using the courtesy title that unmarried women of a certain age often adopted in the West. It saved questions and afforded a measure of protection. Something flickered in his eyes, but he simply nodded. "Mrs. Carmichael, I assure you I am a quiet tenant. I do not drink to excess, and I have no interest in gambling. I mostly just need a clean bed and a decent meal when I am in town." Grace studied him for a moment, weighing the decision. She needed the income, and he seemed respectful enough. "Very well. Come in, and I will show you the available rooms." She led him through the house, very aware of his presence behind her as they climbed the stairs. She showed him 2 of the empty rooms, both clean and simply furnished with a bed, a washstand, a small table and chair, and hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. "This one will do fine," Xavier said, choosing the room that looked out over the street rather than the back garden. "It reminds me a bit of my mother's house back in Amarillo." "You are from Texas, then?" Grace asked, surprising herself with the question. She usually did not engage in personal conversation with her boarders. "Yes, madam. Born and raised on a small ranch outside Amarillo. My father died when I was 16, and I have been working cattle ever since, sending money back to help my mother and younger sisters. They are all married now with families of their own, so I have been drifting from ranch to ranch, following the work." There was no self-pity in his voice, just a simple statement of facts. Grace found herself appreciating that honesty. "I will need the first week's rent in advance, Mr. Eastwick." He reached into his pocket and counted out 3 silver dollars, placing them in her hand. His fingers were calloused and strong, the hands of a man who worked hard for his living. "When would you like me to move in? You may bring your things any time. Supper is at 6 o'clock, breakfast at dawn. I ring a bell for meals." "Thank you, Mrs. Carmichael. I will go fetch my gear from the livery." After he left, Grace stood in the empty room and pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart race beneath her palm. This was ridiculous. She was acting like a schoolgirl, not a grown woman of 23 who had seen enough of life to know better than to spin fantasies about every handsome face that crossed her path. Xavier Eastwick was a boarder, nothing more. He would stay for a season, maybe 2, and then drift on to the next ranch, the next town, the next temporary situation. Cowboys were wanderers by nature, tied to nothing and no one. She forced herself to return to the kitchen and finish preparing supper. By 6 o'clock, the table in the small dining room was set and the food was ready. Mr. Patterson shuffled in first, taking his usual seat. The Sanders brothers arrived next, smelling of horses and leather, their faces sunburned from a day's work. And then Xavier appeared in the doorway, freshly washed and wearing a clean shirt, his dark hair still damp. "Come in, Mr. Eastwick," Grace said, indicating the empty chair. "Everyone, this is our new boarder. He will be working at the Double R." The Sanders brothers nodded in greeting, and Mr. Patterson grunted in acknowledgement. Grace served the meal, a hearty beef stew with fresh bread and butter. She had learned early that men who worked hard all day needed substantial food, and she took pride in providing it. Conversation around the table was sparse, as it usually was. Working men were often too tired for much talk at the end of a long day. But Grace noticed that Xavier ate with obvious appreciation, and when he had finished, he looked up at her with a smile that transformed his serious face. "That was the best meal I have had in months, Mrs. Carmichael. Thank you." "You are welcome," she said, feeling warmth rise in her cheeks. "Would you care for more? There is plenty." "I would not want to take more than my share." "Nonsense. I always make extra." She ladled another serving into his bowl, aware of his eyes following her movements. After supper, the boarders dispersed to their rooms or to the front porch to smoke. Grace cleared the table and washed the dishes, her hands moving through the warm, soapy water while her mind wandered. She thought about her sister's letter, about the mockery and condescension. She thought about her mother's laughter, sharp and dismissive. And she thought about Xavier Eastwick's smile, the way it had lit up his face and made something in her chest feel lighter. The next morning, Grace woke before dawn as always and went downstairs to start breakfast. She built up the fire in the stove and set coffee on to boil, then mixed batter for biscuits and sliced bacon for frying. The kitchen filled with warmth and good smells as the sky outside slowly lightened from black to gray to pink. When she rang the bell for breakfast, Xavier was the first to appear. His hair was neatly combed and his face freshly shaved. "Good morning, Mrs. Carmichael." "Is there anything I can help you with?" Grace was so surprised by the offer that she nearly dropped the pan of biscuits she was holding. In 3 years of running the boarding house, not a single man had ever asked to help with the cooking or serving. "No, thank you. I have everything under control. Please, sit down." He took a seat but kept his eyes on her as she moved around the kitchen, pouring coffee and dishing up plates of bacon, eggs, and hot biscuits with butter and jam. When she set his plate before him, he caught her hand gently. "I mean it," he said quietly. "If you need help with anything, chopping wood or fixing things around the house, you need only ask. I believe in earning my keep." His touch sent a shock of warmth up her arm. Grace pulled her hand back, flustered. "That is kind of you, Mr. Eastwick." "I will keep that in mind." The Sanders brothers and Mr. Patterson arrived then, preventing any further conversation. After breakfast, Xavier headed out to the Double R Ranch, a sprawling cattle operation about 5 miles from town. Grace went about her daily routine of cleaning rooms, doing laundry, and preparing for the next meal. It was hard work, made harder by the summer heat, but she took satisfaction in it. This was her livelihood, her independence. That afternoon, while she was hanging sheets on the clothesline in the back garden, she heard voices from the street. Curious, she walked around to the front of the house and saw 3 women standing on the boardwalk, clearly talking about someone or something with great animation. Grace recognized them as some of Cimarron's most notorious gossips, Mrs. Hendricks, Mrs. Prout, and Miss Colby. "Grace," Mrs. Hendricks called out when she spotted her. "We heard you have a new boarder, that tall Texan who hired on at the Double R." Grace felt a prickle of annoyance. News traveled fast in a small town. "Yes, Mr. Eastwick has taken a room." The three women exchanged meaningful looks. "You should be careful," Miss Colby said, her thin lips pursed with disapproval. "A woman living alone, taking in strange men. People will talk." "People are already talking, it seems," Grace replied more sharply than she intended. "I run a boarding house, Miss Colby. Taking in lodgers is my business." "Still, you should have a care for your reputation," Mrs. Prout added, "especially at your age, if you ever hope to marry." "I have no such hopes," Grace interrupted, her patience worn thin. "And my reputation is my own concern. Now, if you will excuse me, I have work to do." She turned and walked back into her house, closing the door perhaps more firmly than necessary. Standing in her entryway, she took several deep breaths to calm herself. This was exactly the kind of narrow-minded judgment that had driven her from Boston in the first place. Did these women have nothing better to do than speculate about her life? But as her anger cooled, a small seed of doubt planted itself in her mind. What did she hope for, truly? She had told her family she believed in love, but was she prepared for the reality of it? And even if she was, what made her think that a drifting cowboy would be interested in a plain, practical woman who ran a boarding house in a dusty, territorial town? She shook her head firmly. This line of thinking was pointless. Xavier Eastwick was her boarder. That was all he was or ever would be. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace settled into a routine with her new lodger. Xavier was as good as his word, proving to be a quiet, respectful tenant who caused no trouble. He left early for the ranch each morning and returned in the evening, often tired and dusty, but always courteous. On Sundays, when the ranch gave the men a day off, he attended church services in the morning and then usually spent the afternoon reading on the front porch or helping Grace with small repairs around the boarding house. It was during these Sunday afternoons that Grace began to know him better, despite her best efforts to maintain proper distance. She learned that he was 26 years old, that he had a weakness for apple pie, that he could read and write better than many cowhands because his mother had insisted on education. She learned that he sent money home faithfully every month, even though his sisters no longer needed it, because he wanted his mother to live comfortably in her old age. She learned that he loved horses with a passion that made his face light up when he talked about them, and that he dreamed of someday having a small ranch of his own. In turn, she found herself sharing more than she intended. She told him about her aunt, who had raised her after her own mother grew cold and distant, about the boarding house, and how much it meant to her to have something of her own. She did not tell him about her family's mockery or the letter from her sister, but somehow she sensed that he understood there was pain in her past, just as there was in his. One Sunday afternoon in early August, Grace was in the garden trying to dig up a stubborn stump that was interfering with her vegetable patch. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat dripped into her eyes as she wrestled with the shovel. "Mrs. Carmichael, let me help you with that." She looked up to find Xavier standing at the edge of the garden, already rolling up his sleeves. Before she could protest, he had taken the shovel from her hands and positioned himself at the stump. He was strong enough that what had taken her an hour of fruitless effort took him less than 15 minutes. When the stump finally came free, he wiped his forehead and grinned at her. "There you go. What are you planning to plant here?" "Tomatoes," Grace said, still catching her breath from her own efforts. "And maybe some beans if there is room. I do as much of my own growing as possible. It saves money." Xavier nodded thoughtfully. You work hard, Mrs. Carmichael. Too hard for one person, I think. I manage well enough. I do not doubt it, but managing is not the same as thriving. He handed the shovel back to her, his fingers brushing hers in a way that made her pulse quicken. Everyone needs help sometimes. It is not a weakness to accept it. Grace looked up at him, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. His blue eyes held something she could not quite name, something that made her breath catch. Mr. Eastwick. Xavier, he said softly, please, we have been living under the same roof for weeks now. Surely we can dispense with such formality. It would not be proper. Proper. He said the word like it tasted bitter. Mrs. Carmichael, may I be honest with you? She should say no. She should put proper distance between them, retreat into the safety of formality and convention. But instead, she found herself nodding. I do not think you are a Mrs. at all, Xavier said gently. I think you are a Miss, a young woman who took on a courtesy title for protection, and I think you are one of the strongest, most capable people I have ever met. But I also think you are lonely, just as I am lonely. And I wonder if maybe we might be friends, real friends, without all these walls of propriety between us. Grace's throat tightened. People would talk. Let them talk. I stopped caring what people thought of me years ago. He took a step closer. But if it troubles you, I understand. I will keep my distance. I just wanted you to know that I see you, Grace Carmichael. I see how hard you work, how much you care, how kind you are even when the world has not been particularly kind to you. And I think you are remarkable. Before she could respond, before she could process the warmth flooding through her chest at his words, he tipped his hat and walked back toward the house, leaving her standing in the garden with dirt on her hands and tears pricking at her eyes. That night, Grace lay awake in her small bedroom, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Xavier's room was directly above hers, and she could hear the faint creak of floorboards as he moved about. She thought about what he had said, about being friends, about being seen. When was the last time anyone had truly seen her, not as a spinster or a business owner or a disappointment to her family, but as a person with hopes and dreams and fears? She thought about her family's mockery, about their insistence that her dreams of love were foolish. But Xavier had not mocked her. He had called her remarkable. The next morning at breakfast, their eyes met across the table, and Grace allowed herself to smile at him, a real smile that came from somewhere deep inside. Xavier's face lit up in response, and in that moment, something shifted between them. They were no longer simply landlady and boarder. They were two people who had found something unexpected in each other, something worth exploring despite the risks. Over the following weeks, Grace and Xavier's friendship deepened in small, precious increments. He began staying at the boarding house on Saturday nights instead of riding back to the ranch, which meant they had both Saturday evenings and Sundays together. They took walks through town and out into the countryside beyond, talking about everything and nothing. He told her stories about his life on the trail, about the vast herds of cattle and the endless sky, about nights spent under the stars with nothing but a horse and a bedroll. She told him about her dreams of making the boarding house into something more, perhaps a real inn someday, with a proper dining room where travelers could eat whether they were staying the night or not. You could do it, Xavier said one Sunday afternoon as they walked along the creek that ran outside of town. You have the skill and the determination. You just need a bit of capital and maybe another pair of hands to help with the work. Capital is the problem, Grace said with a sigh. I barely make enough to keep the place running and put food on the table. Saving anything substantial would take years. Xavier was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. What if you had a partner? Someone who could invest money and labor, who could help you build something bigger and better, Grace's heart skipped a beat. Are you suggesting? I have been saving my wages for years, Xavier said, not quite meeting her eyes. I have nearly $300 put away. It is not a fortune, but it would be a start. And I can do carpentry, repair work, anything you need. We could expand the boarding house, add more rooms, maybe even build a proper stable out back for guests' horses. Xavier, I could not possibly accept such an offer. That is your money, your future. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression intense. Grace, I am not talking about charity or some kind of business arrangement between strangers. I am talking about building something together, you and me. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Grace felt her pulse race. What are you saying? I am saying that I have grown to care for you very much over these past weeks. I am saying that when I think about my future, I see you in it. I am saying that I would very much like to court you properly if you would allow it. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Xavier, you barely know me. I know enough. I know that you are kind and strong and hardworking. I know that you make the best biscuits I have ever tasted, and that you hum when you are doing laundry. I know that you care for everyone around you, even the people who do not deserve it. I know that you have been hurt by people who should have loved you better, and I know that you are afraid to trust anyone with your heart again. But Grace, I would never hurt you. I would spend every day trying to make you happy, trying to be worthy of you. A sob escaped her throat. My family laughed at me. They said I was a fool for believing in love, that no man would ever want me. They said I should give up my dreams and accept that I was meant for a practical, loveless life. Xavier's face darkened with anger. Your family are fools. Any man would be lucky to have you. I would count myself the most fortunate man alive if you would give me a chance. But you are a cowboy, Grace said, hating how her voice wavered. Cowboys drift from place to place. How do I know you will not grow restless and leave? How do I know this is real? Xavier took both her hands in his touch gentle but firm. I have drifted because I had no reason to stay anywhere, but I have a reason now. You are my reason, Grace. I want to put down roots. I want to build a life in one place with one person. With you. Grace looked up into his blue eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and hope. Her heart, which she had guarded so carefully for so long, cracked open. I care for you too, she whispered. I have tried not to, but I do. I care so much it frightens me. Then let me court you properly. Let me prove to you that this is real, that I am not going anywhere. Give me a chance to make your dreams come true. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Xavier smiled, that brilliant smile that transformed his face, and raised her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was so tender, so reverent that fresh tears spilled down Grace's cheeks. I will not let you down, he promised. I swear it. Word of their courtship spread through Cimarron like wildfire, as Grace had known it would. The gossips had a field day, speculating about everything from Xavier's intentions to Grace's desperation. But for once, Grace found she did not care what people said. Let them talk. She had spent too much of her life caring about the opinions of people who did not matter. What mattered was the way Xavier looked at her when he came home from the ranch each evening, like she was the best thing he had seen all day. What mattered was the way he insisted on helping her with heavy chores, never making her feel weak or incapable, but simply sharing the burden. What mattered was the way he listened when she talked, really listened, as though her thoughts and feelings were important. 3 weeks into their courtship, Xavier approached her after supper with a nervous expression. Grace, would you do me the honor of accompanying me to the harvest dance next Saturday? I know it is a public setting and people will talk, but I would very much like to dance with you. Grace's first instinct was to refuse. She was not much of a dancer, and the thought of being the center of attention at a social event made her stomach clench with anxiety. But when she looked at Xavier's hopeful face, she found herself nodding. "I would like that." The harvest dance was held in the town's meeting hall, a large wooden building that served as church, school, and community center. By the time Grace and Xavier arrived, the place was already crowded with townspeople dressed in their finest clothes. A group of musicians played fiddle and guitar in one corner while couples swirled around the dance floor. Grace felt suddenly very conscious of her simple cotton dress, which she had sewn herself, and which paled in comparison to the fancier gowns some of the younger women wore. But Xavier tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and led her inside with the confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. "You look beautiful," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. "I look plain," she corrected, but she was smiling. "You look perfect to me." They had barely stepped inside when Mrs. Hendricks materialized at their elbow, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Grace, how lovely to see you, and Mr. Eastwick. I hear congratulations are in order on your courtship." "Thank you, Mrs. Hendricks," Grace said politely, though she recognized the gleam in the woman's eye for what it was, a hunger for gossip. "It is quite romantic, really," Mrs. Hendricks continued, her voice carrying to the people around them. "After all these years of spinsterhood, you have finally caught yourself a man, and a handsome one at that." Grace felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, Xavier spoke up. "I consider myself the fortunate one, Mrs. Hendricks. Grace is an exceptional woman, and I am honored that she has agreed to court me. Now, if you will excuse us, I believe they are playing a waltz, and I would very much like to dance with my lady." He swept Grace onto the dance floor before Mrs. Hendricks could say another word. As they moved together to the music, Grace felt some of her tension melt away. Xavier was a surprisingly good dancer, leading her with easy confidence through the steps. "Thank you for that," she said quietly. "Mrs. Hendricks can be rather overbearing." "She is a nosy busybody who should mind her own business," Xavier said flatly. "And if she or anyone else speaks to you like that again, they will answer to me." Grace laughed despite herself. "Xavier, you cannot threaten every gossip in town. There are too many of them. Watch me." They danced 2 more dances before taking a break for refreshments. As they stood on the sidelines sipping punch, Grace noticed several of the younger cowboys eyeing Xavier with a mixture of respect and envy. She also noticed the way some of the unmarried women looked at him with open interest, their gazes sliding right past Grace as though she were invisible. One such woman, a pretty blonde named Sarah Mitchell, approached them with a bold smile. "Mr. Eastwick, I do not believe we have been properly introduced. I am Sarah Mitchell. My father owns the feed store." Xavier nodded politely. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Mitchell. May I introduce Mrs. Grace Carmichael?" Sarah's eyes flicked briefly to Grace and then back to Xavier. "Oh, we all know Grace. She runs that boarding house on the edge of town. Mr. Eastwick, I was wondering if you might honor me with a dance. I have heard you are quite skilled." The request was improper, given that Xavier was clearly attending the dance with Grace, but Sarah seemed unconcerned with propriety. Grace felt a flash of anger but kept her expression neutral. This was Xavier's decision to make. Xavier's response was immediate and unequivocal. "I appreciate the invitation, Miss Mitchell, but I am here with Grace this evening, and I have no interest in dancing with anyone else. I hope you enjoy the rest of the dance." He took Grace's hand and led her back onto the floor, leaving Sarah standing with her mouth slightly open. Grace could not suppress a smile. "You certainly have a way of making yourself clear. I wanted there to be no doubt about where I stand, or who I want to stand beside." As the evening wore on, Grace found herself relaxing and actually enjoying the dance. Xavier kept her laughing with his dry observations about the other guests, and when a group of ranch hands invited him to join them for drinks outside, he politely declined, choosing to stay with Grace instead. On the way home, walking through the cool night air with stars blazing overhead, Xavier took her hand. "Did you have a good time tonight?" "I did," Grace admitted. "Better than I expected, honestly. Thank you for asking me. Thank you for coming with me." "Grace, I know people talk and I know some of them are not kind. Does it bother you, us being together?" She considered the question carefully. "It bothers me that people can be so small-minded and cruel, but no, it does not bother me that we are together. In fact, it is the best thing that has happened to me in longer than I can remember." Xavier stopped walking and turned to face her. The moonlight cast his features in silver and shadow. "I am falling in love with you," he said quietly. "I know it has only been a few weeks, but I cannot help how I feel. You are everything I never knew I was looking for." Grace's breath caught. "Xavier, you do not have to say anything back. I just needed you to know. I wanted to be honest with you about how I feel." But Grace shook her head. "I do need to say something back because I feel the same way. I am falling in love with you too. It terrifies me, but it is true. When I am with you, I feel like myself in a way I never have before. You make me feel seen and valued and cherished. You make me feel like my dreams are not foolish." Xavier cupped her face gently in his hands. "May I kiss you?" "Yes." He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but Grace had no intention of doing so. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet and perfect. She felt the kiss all the way down to her toes, a warmth that spread through her entire body. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," Xavier admitted, resting his forehead against hers. "I have wanted you to," Grace whispered back. They walked the rest of the way home hand in hand, and when they reached the boarding house, Xavier kissed her again on the porch before they went inside. Grace went to bed that night feeling like she was floating, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. The next morning, everything seemed brighter. The sun shone more brilliantly, the coffee tasted better, even the usual chores felt lighter. Grace caught herself humming as she worked, the same way Xavier had once noticed, and she did not try to stop. Over breakfast, Xavier cleared his throat. "Grace, I have been thinking about our future, about what we talked about before, building something together." She set down her coffee cup, giving him her full attention. The other boarders had already left for their various jobs, so they were alone in the dining room. "I want to make this official," Xavier continued. "Not the business part, though we can talk about that too, but us. Grace, I know we have only been courting for a few weeks, but I am 26 years old and I have been around long enough to know what I want. I want you. I want to marry you and spend my life with you. I want to help you build your boarding house into the finest inn in the territory. I want to have children with you and grow old with you. I want everything." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "Xavier, are you proposing to me?" "Not yet," he said with a small smile. "I want to do it properly with a ring and all the tradition, but I wanted you to know my intentions so there is no doubt. I am not playing games or passing time. This is real for me. You are real for me." "It is real for me too," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I would find this. My family made me believe it was impossible, that I was foolish for even hoping. But here you are, and you are everything I dreamed of and more." "Then we will do this right," Xavier said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I will save up for a proper ring. I will ask you formally. And then, if you say yes, we will build a life together that will make your family eat their mocking words." Grace laughed through her tears. "I do not care about my family anymore. I only care about us. Good. Because they do not deserve you." 2 weeks later, on a golden Sunday afternoon in September, Xavier took Grace on a picnic out by the creek. He had packed a basket with bread and cheese and apples, and they spread a blanket under the cottonwood trees and watched the water ripple past. They talked about their plans for expanding the boarding house, about the possibility of adding a small restaurant for travelers, about all the dreams they had been afraid to voice before finding each other. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Xavier stood and helped Grace to her feet. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small box and opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. It was not elaborate or expensive, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. "Grace Carmichael," Xavier said, dropping to one knee, "you are the strongest, kindest, most remarkable woman I have ever known. You took me in when I was just another drifting cowboy with nowhere to call home. You gave me not just a room, but a place to belong. You showed me what it means to build something real and lasting. And you made me believe in love, the kind of love I had stopped thinking existed. Will you do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife?" Grace could barely see him through her tears. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you. I love you so much." He stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that made her head spin. When they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing and crying at the same time. "I cannot wait to spend my life with you," Xavier said, holding her close. "Neither can I." They were married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Cimarron church. Grace wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Xavier wore his best suit, which he had purchased specially for the occasion. The guest list was small, just a few friends from town and the other boarders from Grace's establishment. Grace's family back east had not been invited, and Grace found she did not miss their presence at all. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed Grace with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Afterward, they held a small reception at the boarding house, with cake and punch and music from a local fiddle player. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Xavier swept Grace up in his arms and carried her over the threshold of what was now their shared home. "Welcome to the first day of our new life, Mrs. Eastwick," he said, setting her down gently in the entryway. "I quite like the sound of that," Grace said, looping her arms around his neck. "Mrs. Grace Eastwick." "I love you," Xavier said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I will love you every day for the rest of my life." "And I will love you," Grace promised. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, filled with whispered promises and gentle discoveries. Afterward, lying in Xavier's arms in the darkness, Grace marveled at how much her life had changed in just a few short months. She had gone from a lonely spinster running a boarding house to a married woman with a partner who loved and respected her, who believed in her dreams and wanted to help her achieve them. The next morning, they began their new life together in earnest. Xavier moved his few possessions into Grace's room, which was now their room. He gave notice at the Double R Ranch, explaining that he would be going into business with his wife instead of working as a hired hand. The ranch foreman was disappointed to lose such a reliable worker, but wished them well. Over the following months, Grace and Xavier threw themselves into expanding the boarding house. Using Xavier's savings and the steady income from their current boarders, they hired a carpenter to add 3 more rooms to the second floor. They built a stable out back, just as Xavier had suggested, where guests could board their horses. They repainted the exterior and planted flowers in front to make the place more welcoming. Word spread about the improvements, and soon the boarding house was consistently full. Grace's reputation as an excellent cook brought in travelers who were not even staying overnight, but simply wanted a good meal. Seeing an opportunity, Grace and Xavier decided to convert the front parlor into a small dining room open to the public. The restaurant opened in the spring of 1883, nearly a year after Grace and Xavier had first met. They called it simply Carmichael's Dining Room, keeping Grace's maiden name as a nod to the business she had built on her own before they met. The dining room was an immediate success, serving hearty meals to ranch hands, travelers, and townspeople alike. Grace did most of the cooking while Xavier managed the front of house and the boarding rooms. They worked long hours, often falling into bed exhausted at the end of each day. But they were happy, building something together just as Xavier had promised. Their partnership was one of equals, with each bringing their own strengths to the endeavor. Grace was the creative force, coming up with new dishes and ways to improve the guest's experience. Xavier was the practical one, handling repairs and negotiating with suppliers and keeping the books balanced. By summer, they were successful enough to hire help. They brought on a young woman named Clara to assist with the cooking and cleaning, and a teenage boy named Billy to help with the stable and the heavy work. This freed up some of Grace's time, allowing her to focus on the aspects of the business she enjoyed most. One evening in July, exactly 1 year after Grace had stood in the middle of Cimarron's Main Street reading her sister's mocking letter, she and Xavier sat on their porch watching the sunset. Business had been good that day, with every room full and a steady stream of diners throughout the afternoon and evening. "You remember when we first met?" Grace asked, leaning against Xavier's shoulder. "I nearly ran into you outside the general store." "I remember," Xavier said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen." Grace laughed. "You did not. I was dusty and upset and probably looked like a mess. You looked beautiful to me and determined. I could see it in your eyes, this strength and resilience. I think I started falling in love with you right then, even though I did not realize it yet." "I was so afraid," Grace admitted. "Afraid to believe that someone like you could care for someone like me. My family had convinced me that love was not in the cards for me, that I should settle for a practical, joyless existence." "Your family were wrong about everything," Xavier said firmly, "and I hope they know it. Have you heard from them at all?" Grace shook her head. "No, and I do not expect to. When I wrote to tell them about our marriage, there was no response. But honestly, I am fine with that. They are not part of my life anymore. You are my family now. And soon we might expand that family," Xavier said meaningfully. Grace felt her cheeks warm. They had been trying for a baby for several months now, hoping to add children to their happy home. "Perhaps," she said. "Time will tell." As it turned out, time did not take long to tell. A month later, Grace realized she had missed her monthly courses. A visit to the town doctor confirmed what she suspected. She was expecting their first child. When she told Xavier the news, he lifted her off her feet and spun her around, both of them laughing with joy. "We are going to be parents," he said wonderingly. "Grace, you have made me the happiest man alive. And you have made all my dreams come true," she replied, cupping his face in her hands. "Every single one." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and into winter. Grace continued working at the dining room and boarding house, though Xavier insisted she take on less of the heavy work. Clara and Billy proved invaluable, picking up the slack without complaint. The townspeople, even those who had gossiped most viciously about Grace's spinsterhood and sudden courtship, now treated the expectant couple with warmth and support. In late February of 1884, Grace went into labor on a cold, clear night. Xavier sent Billy racing for the midwife while he stayed by Grace's side, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement as the contractions came and went. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 12 hours, but finally, just as dawn was breaking, their son was born. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the squalling infant in Grace's arms. "A healthy, strong boy." Grace looked down at her son, at his red face and tiny fists, and felt love so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes. Xavier sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around her shoulders, staring at their baby with wonder. "What should we name him?" Grace asked. "I was thinking James, after my father," Xavier said, "but only if you agree." "James Eastwick," Grace said, testing the name. "I like it." "James Alexander Eastwick. Alexander, after my aunt who left me this house. Without her, none of this would have been possible." "James Alexander Eastwick it is, then," Xavier said, gently touching his son's tiny hand. When the baby grasped his finger, Xavier's eyes grew bright with tears. "Hello, James. I am your father, and I promise to love you and protect you and teach you everything I know." The first few weeks with a newborn were exhausting but wonderful. Grace had never felt so tired or so happy in her entire life. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, taking on more of the business responsibilities so Grace could focus on nursing and caring for James. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with the baby when he was fussy, and looked at his son like he was the greatest miracle ever created. With Clara's help managing the boarding house and dining room, Grace was able to spend most of her time with James during those early months. She loved the weight of him in her arms, the sweet baby smell, the way he would stop crying the moment he heard her voice. Xavier often came upstairs during breaks in his work just to check on them, unable to stay away for long. As James grew from a helpless newborn into a chubby, smiling baby, the boarding house and dining room continued to thrive. They were now known throughout the region as one of the finest establishments in the territory, with excellent food and clean, comfortable rooms. Grace and Xavier talked about expanding even further, perhaps purchasing the empty lot next door and building a proper hotel. One afternoon in late summer, when James was 6 months old, a well-dressed man arrived at the dining room asking for Mrs. Eastwick. Grace, who was in the kitchen nursing James, handed the baby to Clara and went out to meet the visitor. "Mrs. Eastwick, my name is Thomas Carrington. I am an attorney from Santa Fe. I have been trying to locate you on behalf of a client." Grace felt a flutter of anxiety. "On behalf of whom?" "Your aunt, Martha Carmichael, or rather, her estate. It seems there was an error in the original reading of her will. A substantial sum of money that was meant to come to you was accidentally tied up in probate. The matter has now been resolved, and I am here to inform you that you have inherited an additional $2,000. Grace stared at him in shock. $2,000. "But my aunt left me this house. I did not know she had any significant money." "Apparently, she made some very shrewd investments years ago, and they paid off handsomely. The money is yours, free and clear. I have the paperwork here for you to sign." In a daze, Grace signed the necessary documents and accepted the bank draft for $2,000. After Mr. Carrington left, she stood in the dining room holding the slip of paper and feeling like she might faint. This was more money than she had ever imagined having. With this, they could build their hotel. They could secure their family's future. When Xavier came in from the stable and saw the expression on her face, he immediately crossed to her side. "Grace, what is wrong? Is it James?" "James is fine. Everything is fine. Better than fine." She showed him the bank draft, explaining about the inheritance. Xavier whistled low. $2,000. "Grace, this is incredible." "I know. I cannot quite believe it. Xavier, we could build that hotel we talked about. We could make this place into something truly special." Or, Xavier said slowly, we could do something else with part of it. What do you mean? I have been thinking. We work so hard and we have been blessed with success, but we never take time for ourselves. What if we use some of this money to take a trip? Just the two of us and James. We could visit my mother in Texas, introduce her to her grandson. We could take a real honeymoon, the kind we never had because we were too busy working. And then, when we come back, we can start planning the hotel. Grace considered this. They had been working nonstop for 2 years, and while she loved what they had built, the idea of taking time away was appealing. I would like to meet your mother. You talk about her so often. Then it is settled. We will hire someone to manage the boarding house and dining room while we are gone. Clara and Billy can handle most of it with supervision. We will leave in a month, after we get everything arranged. The trip to Texas was a revelation. They took the train from Santa Fe to Amarillo, a journey that would have taken weeks on horseback, but took only a couple of days by rail. Xavier's mother lived in a small house on the outskirts of Amarillo, surrounded by her daughters and their families. Mrs. Margaret Eastwick was a small, sturdy woman with gray hair and the same blue eyes as her son. When she saw Xavier walking up the path with Grace and James, she burst into tears and ran to embrace them. "My boy," she said, hugging Xavier tightly. "My darling boy, and this must be Grace and my grandson. Oh, let me look at him. He is perfect, absolutely perfect." They stayed in Amarillo for 2 weeks, and Grace felt immediately welcomed into Xavier's family. His sisters and their husbands were warm and friendly. His nieces and nephews were delightful, and his mother treated Grace like she was her own daughter. It was so different from Grace's own cold, judgmental family that it brought tears to her eyes more than once. One evening, while Xavier was outside with his brothers-in-law and James was napping, Margaret sat with Grace on the porch and took her hand. "I want to thank you," Margaret said, "for making my son so happy. I worried about him for years, drifting from ranch to ranch with no real home, but he has found his home with you. Anyone can see how much he loves you and that baby." "He has made me happy too," Grace said. "Happier than I ever thought possible. I came from a family that did not understand me or value me, but Xavier sees me for who I really am, and he loves me anyway. He has given me everything I dreamed of." "That is what love should be," Margaret said wisely. "Two people who see each other clearly and choose each other anyway every single day. You and Xavier have that, and it is a precious thing. Guard it well." "I will," Grace promised. After their time in Amarillo, they continued on to San Antonio, where they spent a week exploring the city and enjoying time together as a family. They visited the Alamo, shopped in the markets, and ate at restaurants where someone else did the cooking for a change. It was a magical time, free from the responsibilities and stresses of running their business. But as wonderful as the trip was, Grace found herself eager to return to Cimarron by the end. This was their home, the life they had built together, and she missed it. When they finally arrived back at the boarding house in early October, Clara and Billy greeted them with relief and joy. "We managed fine," Clara reported, "but we are so glad you are home. Some of the regular guests have been asking for you." Over the next several months, Grace and Xavier used the remainder of Grace's inheritance to begin construction on the hotel. They purchased the lot next door and hired a contractor to build a 2-story structure with 12 guest rooms, a large dining hall, and a lobby with a front desk. The project took nearly a year, but when it was completed in the fall of 1885, the Eastwick Hotel was the finest establishment in Cimarron. The grand opening was a celebration the whole town attended. Grace stood with Xavier and James, now a toddling 18-month-old, and looked around at what they had created. The hotel was beautiful, with fine furnishings and modern conveniences. But more than that, it represented everything they had overcome and achieved together. That night, after the guests had gone and James was asleep, Grace and Xavier sat in the lobby of their new hotel. "Do you remember when I first came to your boarding house?" Xavier asked. "I was just a drifter looking for a place to sleep." "And I was a lonely woman who had given up on her dreams," Grace said. "My family laughed at me for believing in love. They told me I was a fool." "They were wrong," Xavier said, pulling her close. "Love is real, Grace. What we have is real, and look at what we have built because of it." "They laughed at my dreams," Grace said softly. "But you made every dream come true. You gave me love, partnership, a family, and a future I never could have imagined." "We gave each other those things," Xavier corrected. "We built this life together." Grace looked around the lobby of their hotel, at the polished wood and gleaming windows, and felt a sense of deep satisfaction. But even more than the material success, she treasured the life she shared with Xavier. The way he still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world. The way he was a devoted father to James. The way they worked together as partners in every sense of the word. Over the next several years, their success continued to grow. The hotel thrived, and they expanded their dining operation to include a separate restaurant with a full menu. They hired a staff to help manage everything, which gave them more time to focus on their growing family. Grace gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Emily Margaret, in 1886. 2 years later, their third child arrived, another boy they named William Thomas. With 3 children and a thriving business, life was busy but wonderful. Grace had never imagined she could be so happy, so fulfilled. She thought sometimes about her family back in Boston, about the letter from her sister that had arrived on that hot July day years ago. She wondered if they knew about her success, about the love she had found, about the beautiful family she had built. Part of her hoped they did, hoped they understood how wrong they had been to mock her dreams. But mostly, she did not think about them at all. They were part of her past, and her present was far too rich and full to waste time on old wounds. In 1890, when Grace was 31 and Xavier was 34, they received an unexpected visitor. Grace was in the hotel restaurant overseeing the lunch service when the desk clerk informed her that someone was asking for her. She went out to the lobby to find a well-dressed woman in her late 20s standing there, looking around with obvious curiosity. "May I help you?" Grace asked politely. The woman turned, and Grace felt a jolt of recognition. Rachel! It was her youngest sister, the one who had written that mocking letter 8 years ago. Rachel looked older now, her face harder, with lines around her mouth that spoke of disappointment. "Hello, Grace," Rachel said stiffly. "I hope I am not intruding." "What are you doing here?" Grace asked, too surprised for politeness. "May we speak somewhere private?" Grace led her sister to a small sitting room off the lobby and closed the door. They sat facing each other, the silence heavy with years of hurt and anger. "Why have you come?" Grace asked finally. Rachel looked down at her gloved hands. "I came to apologize, and to tell you that you were right about everything." Grace waited, saying nothing. "You remember when I wrote to you about my engagement to the banker," Rachel continued. "I married him. I thought I was so clever, marrying for money and security. I thought you were a fool for holding out for love. But Grace, I have been miserable. My husband is cold and controlling. He treats me like a possession, not a person. We have no affection between us, no partnership. I see now that I am the fool, not you." "I am sorry you are unhappy," Grace said, and she meant it. Despite everything, Rachel was still her sister. "Mother told me not to come. She said you would gloat, that you would throw our mockery back in our faces. But I had to see you to see if the rumors were true. What rumors? That you married a cowboy and built a successful hotel together, that you have a beautiful family and a thriving business, that you are happy. Rachel's voice broke slightly on the last word. The rumors are true, Grace said gently. I am very happy. My husband is the best man I have ever known. We have 3 wonderful children and a life we built together through hard work and partnership. I love what we have created here. I am so sorry, Grace. Sorry for laughing at you, for dismissing your dreams as foolish. You were brave enough to believe in love and you found it. I was too afraid, and now I am paying the price. Grace looked at her sister and felt the old anger finally drain away. Rachel looked so defeated, so lost. It is never too late to change your life, Rachel. If you are unhappy, do something about it. It is not that simple. I have a child now, a daughter. I cannot just leave. Then stay and fight for your happiness. Talk to your husband. Go to counseling with your pastor. Find a way to build something better, but do not accept a life of misery just because you made a mistake. Rachel nodded, wiping at her eyes. Thank you for not turning me away. I would not have blamed you if you had. You are my sister, Grace said. I may not forgive everything that was said and done, but I do not wish you ill. I hope you find a way to be happy. They talked for a while longer, and Grace even took Rachel on a tour of the hotel and introduced her to Xavier and the children. When Rachel left later that afternoon to catch the train back east, there was a tentative understanding between them. Grace doubted they would ever be close. The wounds were too deep for that. But at least the festering anger was gone, replaced by a kind of peaceful detachment. That evening, Grace told Xavier about Rachel's visit. They were in their private quarters above the hotel, the children finally asleep after the bedtime routine of stories and songs. How do you feel about seeing her again? Xavier asked, pulling Grace into his arms. Sad, mostly. Sad that she is so unhappy, and sad that so many years were wasted on bitterness and judgment. But also grateful. Grateful that I had the courage to believe in love when everyone told me I was a fool. Grateful that you came into my life and proved them all wrong. I am the grateful one, Xavier said, kissing her forehead. You gave me a home, Grace, not just this place, but a real home, a family, a purpose. Before I met you, I was just drifting through life. You gave me roots. We gave each other roots, Grace said, echoing his words from years ago. We built this together. As they stood there in each other's arms, listening to the sounds of the hotel settling around them, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 8 years ago, she had been a lonely, mocked spinster running a struggling boarding house. Her family had laughed at her dreams of finding true love, told her she was foolish to believe such things were possible for someone like her. But then Xavier had walked into her life, a drifting cowboy looking for a room. And somehow, miraculously, they had found in each other exactly what they both needed. He had believed in her dreams and helped make them reality. He had loved her with a steadiness and devotion that still took her breath away. He had been her partner in every sense, working beside her to build a life neither of them could have achieved alone. The years continued to pass in a blur of work and family and love. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working with his father around the hotel. Emily was bright and imaginative, always making up stories and putting on little plays for her family. William was the adventurous one, constantly getting into mischief and keeping his parents on their toes. In 1892, Grace gave birth to their 4th and final child, another daughter they named Catherine Rose. With 4 children and a thriving business, their lives were full to bursting. But Grace would not have changed a single thing. Every challenge they faced together. Every joy was doubled because they shared it. The hotel continued to be successful, becoming known throughout New Mexico territory, and beyond as a premier establishment. They employed a staff of 15 people, including Clara and Billy, who had grown up with the business and now held positions of responsibility. The restaurant served the finest food in the region, thanks to Grace's skills and her insistence on quality ingredients. Xavier proved to be brilliant at the business side of things, managing the finances and maintaining relationships with suppliers and contractors. But he was also still involved in the daily operations, never too important to fix a leaky pipe or repair a broken fence. The staff loved him for his fairness and willingness to work alongside them. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1893, Xavier surprised Grace with a trip to Denver, just the two of them. Margaret came from Texas to watch the children, and Grace and Xavier took the train north to Colorado. They stayed in a grand hotel, dined at expensive restaurants, and attended the theater. It was wonderful and romantic, a reminder that beneath the responsibilities of business ownership and parenthood, they were still the two people who had fallen in love by a creek outside Cimarron. One evening during the trip, they were walking through downtown Denver after dinner, admiring the electric streetlights that were still a novelty in many western cities. Xavier suddenly stopped and turned to face Grace. "You have any regrets?" he asked. "About the life we have built, the choices we made?" "Not a single one," Grace said without hesitation. "Why do you ask?" "Because sometimes I think about how hard you work, how much responsibility you carry. I wonder if you ever wish for a simpler life, maybe a husband who could have given you more luxury, less toil." Grace cupped his face in her hands, looking into those blue eyes that still made her heart skip a beat. "Xavier Eastwick, you gave me everything I ever wanted. Not luxury or ease, but partnership and love and purpose. We built our success together, side by side. That means more to me than all the luxury in the world. I would not trade our life for anything." "I love you so much," Xavier said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every day I wake up grateful that you said yes when I asked you to take a chance on a drifting cowboy. And I wake up grateful that the cowboy saw something worth loving in a plain boarding house keeper who everyone said was too old and too foolish to dream of love." "You were never plain," Xavier said firmly. "You were beautiful then and you are beautiful now. And your dreams were never foolish. They were brave and true, and I am honored that I got to help make them come true." They kissed there under the electric lights of Denver, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something extraordinary together. The years rolled on. The children grew and thrived. James was accepted to university in Santa Fe, studying business so he could eventually take over management of the hotel. Emily showed a talent for art and spent hours sketching the landscape around Cimarron. William decided he wanted to be a veterinarian and began apprenticing with the local doctor who treated animals. Catherine, the baby, was still young but already showing signs of her father's head for numbers. In 1898, when Grace was 39 and Xavier was 42, they celebrated the 15th anniversary of their first meeting. The hotel was now one of the most successful businesses in the territory, and they had recently purchased a small ranch on the outskirts of town where they raised horses. It had been Xavier's dream to work with horses again, and Grace had been happy to help him achieve it. They threw a party to celebrate the anniversary, inviting friends and staff and business associates. The hotel's dining hall was decorated with flowers and bunting, and there was music and dancing long into the night. At one point, Grace found herself standing with Clara, who had become not just an employee but a dear friend over the years. "I remember when it was just you running that little boarding house all alone," Clara said, looking around at the crowded, festive room. "Look at what you have built, Grace. It is remarkable." "We built it together," Grace said, including Clara in that assessment. I could not have done any of this without help from people I trust. You and Billy have been with us from nearly the beginning. You are part of this success too. Later that evening, Xavier pulled Grace onto the dance floor for a waltz, just as he had at that harvest dance so many years ago. They moved together with the ease of long practice, two people who knew each other's rhythms intimately. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked, noting her thoughtful expression. "I am thinking about that letter," Grace admitted. "The one from my sister that arrived the day we met. She was telling me to give up on love, that I was a fool for believing in it, and I was standing in the street thinking she might be right. I am very glad you did not listen to her. So am I. Xavier, do you ever think about how different our lives could have been? If you had chosen a different boarding house, or if I had turned you away, or if we had not allowed ourselves to fall in love." "I try not to think about that," Xavier said, pulling her closer. "It is too frightening to imagine. You are my whole world, Grace. You and our children and the life we have built. I cannot picture existing without you." "You will never have to," Grace promised. "We are in this together for the rest of our lives." As the night wore on and the party gradually wound down, Grace stood on the balcony of the hotel looking out over Cimarron. The town had grown significantly in the 15 years since she and Xavier had married. There were more buildings now, more businesses, more families. The railroad had brought prosperity and progress. And through it all, the Eastwick Hotel had stood as a cornerstone of the community, a place of warmth and welcome. She thought about all the people who had passed through these doors over the years. Travelers and settlers, families and lone cowboys, businessmen and artists. Each one had a story, just as she and Xavier had a story. Some of those stories were happy, some sad. But Grace liked to think that everyone who stayed at the hotel left feeling a little bit better than when they arrived, because that was what she and Xavier had always tried to provide. Not just a clean room and a good meal, but genuine hospitality and care. "Come to bed, love," Xavier said, joining her on the balcony. "It has been a long day." Grace took one last look at the moonlit street, then turned and followed her husband inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities as every day did, but tonight she was simply grateful. Grateful for love, for family, for the dreams that had come true, and for the cowboy who had made it all possible. The new century arrived with great fanfare and celebration. The year 1900 seemed to promise endless possibility and progress. The Eastwick Hotel marked the occasion with a grand New Year's party that became the talk of the territory. Grace and Xavier, now in their early 40s, were established pillars of the community. They served on town councils and charitable boards. They were known not just for their business success, but for their generosity and kindness. Their children were growing into impressive young adults. James, now 18, was about to take on more responsibility at the hotel while continuing his studies. Emily, at 16, had several of her paintings displayed in the hotel lobby, and people were beginning to commission work from her. William, 14, spent every spare moment with animals, demonstrating a gift for understanding and healing them. And Catherine, at 8 years old, was the darling of the hotel staff, charming everyone with her quick wit and her father's head for mathematics. In the spring of 1901, Grace received word that her mother had passed away. The letter came from Rachel, who wrote with sadness but also a strange sense of relief. Apparently, their mother had become increasingly bitter and isolated in her final years, alienating even those family members who had tolerated her judgment and criticism. "Will you go to the funeral?" Xavier asked after Grace shared the news. Grace considered this carefully. "No," she said finally. "I mourned the loss of my mother's love years ago, Going to Boston now would be hypocritical. She made her choices and I made mine. I do not regret my choices and I will not pretend to regret hers." "That seems wise," Xavier agreed. "Though if you change your mind, we can make arrangements." But Grace did not change her mind. Instead, she wrote a brief condolence letter to Rachel and let that be the end of it. She had no desire to revisit that chapter of her life. Her real family was here, in this hotel, in this town, with this man who had loved her faithfully for nearly 20 years. That summer, James came to his parents with an announcement. He had fallen in love with a young woman named Sarah Chen, whose parents owned a laundry business in town. Sarah was smart and hardworking, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who had come to America seeking a better life. James wanted to marry her, but he was worried about how his parents would react to him marrying someone from such a different background. Grace and Xavier exchanged a glance, then Grace reached across the table to take her son's hand. "James, your father and I built our life on love and partnership. If you have found that with Sarah, then you have our blessing and our happiness. Bring her to dinner so we can get to know her properly." The relief on James's face was palpable. The dinner went well. Sarah was indeed a remarkable young woman, educated and ambitious, with dreams of expanding her family's business. She and James clearly adored each other, finishing each other's sentences and sharing private smiles. Grace saw in them the same partnership she and Xavier had found, and it filled her heart with joy. James and Sarah were married in the fall of 1902, with a beautiful ceremony that blended both families' traditions. They moved into a small house near the hotel, and Sarah began helping with the management of the hotel's laundry operations, while James took on more of the day-to-day business operations. Xavier and Grace found themselves able to step back slightly, secure in the knowledge that the next generation was ready to take the reins. In 1904, Grace became a grandmother for the first time when Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named Daniel. Holding her grandson in her arms, Grace felt a profound sense of completion. She had gone from a lonely, mocked spinster to a beloved grandmother, from a struggling boarding house keeper to the co-owner of a successful hotel empire. And through it all, Xavier had been by her side, her partner and her love. "Look at what we made," Xavier said softly, standing behind her as she rocked the baby. "Not just this beautiful grandson, but everything. The family, the business, the life. We made all of it together." "You made my dreams come true," Grace said, looking up at him with tears in her eyes. "Every single one of them. When my family laughed at me, when they told me I was a fool for believing in love, you proved them wrong. You showed me that dreams are worth holding on to, that love is real and powerful and transformative. And you showed me what it means to have a home," Xavier replied. "To belong somewhere, to be part of something bigger than myself. Grace, loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life." As the years continued to pass, their family grew and flourished. Emily married a fellow artist, and they opened a gallery in Santa Fe while maintaining close ties to Cimarron. William became the town's veterinarian, beloved by every rancher and farmer in the area. Catherine, their youngest, surprised everyone by developing a passion for law and becoming one of the first women to practice as an attorney in New Mexico. The hotel continued to thrive under James and Sarah's management, modernizing with the times while maintaining the warmth and hospitality that had always been its hallmark. Grace and Xavier officially retired from daily operations in 1910, though they still lived in their quarters above the hotel and could often be found offering advice or simply visiting with guests. In their retirement, they had time to pursue other interests. Xavier focused on the horse ranch, which had grown into a respected breeding operation. Grace started a small lending library at the hotel for the community, and she volunteered with various charitable organizations. They traveled occasionally, visiting their children and grandchildren, exploring parts of the country they had never seen. But mostly, they simply enjoyed being together. After nearly 30 years of marriage, they were still deeply in love, still each other's best friend and favorite companion. They took long walks together every evening when the weather permitted, talking about everything and nothing. They sat on the porch in the mornings with their coffee, watching the sun rise over the mountains. They read to each other before bed, sharing books and ideas and opinions. In the spring of 1915, on their 32nd wedding anniversary, Xavier arranged a surprise. He had a photographer come to take pictures of the whole family, something they had never done before. Grace, now 56, Xavier at 59, all 4 of their children with their spouses, and their 7 grandchildren gathered in front of the hotel for a formal portrait. As Grace stood there surrounded by the family she and Xavier had created, she felt a sense of profound gratitude. This was her legacy, not just the hotel or the business success, but these people. These children who had grown into good, kind, successful adults. These grandchildren who would carry the family forward into the future. And most of all, this man standing beside her, his hand warm in hers, who had believed in her when no one else did. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Grace and Xavier sat alone in their sitting room. Grace had the anniversary photograph in her hands, studying the faces of their family. "Do you remember what you said to me that day by the creek?" she asked Xavier. "When you proposed, I remember every word. I said you were the strongest, kindest, most remarkable woman I had ever known. I said you had shown me what it means to build something real and lasting. And I said you made me believe in love. All of that is still true," Grace said softly. "But Xavier, you did all of those things for me too. You were strong when I needed strength. You were kind when the world was cruel. You built this extraordinary life with me, brick by brick, day by day. And you taught me that love is not just real. It is the most powerful force in the world. It can transform everything." Xavier moved to sit beside her, taking the photograph and setting it gently on the table. Then he cupped her face in his hands, those same hands that had steadied her so many years ago when they had collided outside the general store. "Grace Eastwick, loving you has been the great privilege of my life. Every day I wake up grateful that I walked into your boarding house looking for a room. Every day I thank God that you took a chance on a drifting cowboy. You are my home, my heart, my everything, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." They kissed, a gentle meeting of lips that still sparked with the same passion they had felt as young lovers. When they pulled apart, both had tears on their faces, but they were tears of joy. "They laughed at my dreams," Grace whispered, "but you made every single one come true. You gave me love and partnership and family. You gave me success and respect and happiness. You gave me a life beyond my wildest imaginings." "We gave each other that life," Xavier corrected, as he always did. "We built it together, and it is more beautiful than anything I could have dreamed of alone." As they sat together in the quiet of their home, the hotel settling around them with its familiar creaks and sighs, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She thought about the letter from her sister, about standing in the dusty street feeling lost and mocked and alone. She thought about the tall cowboy who had apologized for nearly running into her, whose blue eyes had held kindness and possibility. She thought about taking a chance, opening her heart, believing that maybe, just maybe, love was real after all. And it had been real. More real and more powerful than she could have imagined. This love had built an empire, raised a family, created a legacy that would outlast them both. This love had transformed two lonely, drifting souls into partners who faced the world together, who built dreams into reality through hard work and devotion and unwavering faith in each other. Grace Carmichael had believed in love when everyone told her she was a fool. And Xavier Eastwick had walked into her life and proved that believing in love was the wisest thing she had ever done. Together, they had created something beautiful and lasting. Together, they had made every dream come true. The years continued to flow gently forward. Grace and Xavier aged gracefully together, their hair turning silver, their faces gaining lines that spoke of a life well lived and much laughter. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1923, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The Eastwick Hotel was now in its third generation of family management, with James and Sarah's eldest son beginning to take on more responsibility. On a warm evening in late September of 1927, Grace and Xavier sat on their favorite bench in the hotel's garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. They were both in their late 60s now, slowed by age but still sharp of mind and full of love for each other. "Do you think we did well?" Grace asked, leaning against Xavier's shoulder as she had countless times before. "With our lives, with our family, I think we did better than well," Xavier replied, his arm around her. "I think we created something extraordinary. Not just the hotel or the business, though those are impressive, but the family we raised, the love we shared, the way we faced every challenge together. That is what I am most proud of." "I am proud too," Grace said, "and grateful. So very grateful that I did not listen to the voices telling me to give up on love. So grateful that you saw something worth loving in me. Grace, you were always worth loving. From the very first moment I saw you, I knew you were special, and every day since has only confirmed that truth." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. The hotel behind them glowed with warm light, filled with guests and staff, and the next generation of their family. The sounds of laughter and conversation drifted out to them, the soundtrack of a successful, thriving establishment. "I love you, Xavier Eastwick," Grace said softly, "now and always. And I love you, Grace Eastwick. You are my heart, my home, my everything. You always have been, and you always will be." As the last light faded from the sky and the stars shone brilliantly overhead, they sat together in perfect contentment. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built an extraordinary life together through love and hard work and unwavering partnership. Two people who had proven that dreams are worth believing in, that love is real and powerful and transformative. They had started with nothing but hope and determination. They had faced mockery and doubt, hardship and challenge, but they had never given up on each other or on the dreams they shared. And in the end, they had created something beautiful and lasting, a legacy of love that would continue long after they were gone. Grace thought about that letter from her sister one last time, about the mockery and dismissal. She thought about how close she had come to believing them, to accepting that love was not meant for her. But she had held on to hope, and that hope had led her to Xavier. Together, they had proven everyone wrong. Together, they had made every dream come true. And as they sat together under the stars, two souls perfectly united, Grace knew with absolute certainty that this, all of this, the love and the family and the life they had built, was exactly what she had been dreaming of all along. Xavier had not just made her dreams come true. He had shown her that the reality of love was even better than any dream could be. The cowboy had indeed made every dream come true. And in doing so, he had given Grace Eastwick a life of love and joy beyond measure. Together, they had created their own happily ever after, one built on partnership, respect, devotion, and a love that would last forever.